Yeah. My name is Ted Nordhaus. I'm the founder and executive director of the Breakthrough Institute. We're a think tank based in Oakland that focuses on technological solutions to environmental problems. And we have, in the last few years, gotten especially interested in agriculture and its relationship to both human development and conservation. It's the single largest human impact on the planet. And when you sort of look at long-term processes of development, they usually involve most people actually leaving agriculture and doing something else, like everyone else in this room is. So thinking about what a food system and an agriculture system needs to look like in a world where most people aren't going to be farmers and where we don't turn our entire planet into a gigantic farm, whether it's a big one or a small one, is sort of our primary interest. Good. Michael.
Michael Dimock, Roots of Change. We're a food movement organization, been active in the state of California and nationally for about 12, 13 years. What brings me to this stage is that we have been have an active voice around GMOs, primarily in the areas that have to do with transparency, labeling fight. That was the place where we weighed in the most on this issue. And we've had a very nuanced position, and I got a lot of flack for being here tonight from my crowd. But we're okay with that.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So I'm Pam Ronald. I am from San Mateo, and I did my PhD at UC Berkeley, and I've been a professor in the Department of Plant Pathology and the Genome Center at UC Davis for 25 years. And I have always been interested in food and farming and fell in love with genetics. And I decided to study rice, devote my career to the study of rice, because it's a staple food for more than half the world's people. So I studied genes that make rice tolerant to disease or tolerant of stress.
So to start, I thought rather than asking you what you thought of this film, I'd ask you what this film made you feel, because for a film that's incredibly rationalist, it's also evocative of emotion, at least for me. Did you have feelings coming up, Pam?
Absolutely. I felt like this big burden had been taken off my shoulders and placed on Scott's shoulders. So it's so, as a scientist, we were a little skeptical when we met Scott, like, what, you're going to do a film? Yeah, that's what everybody says, and, we usually get the science wrong. But clearly, Scott and his team really spent a lot of time trying to get the science right. And as a scientist, it's just so wonderful to have a creative director and team put out a beautiful movie and that gets the science right. So as scientists, we're not known to be fantastic communicators. Hand it over to Scott now. So I'm very relieved.
How about you, Michael?
Yeah, I had. It's interesting. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but I had kind of a mixed reaction. The science piece I liked. I liked the science piece because that's not the piece that we fight about, and so I felt good about it. I felt actually kind of relieved too because I don't have. It's like, okay, wow, I don't have to worry about that as well to weigh in on that stuff. But I felt disappointment because the things that I care about weren't really taken off in the film, except for in a peripheral way. The solutions to those challenges, which you talk about in your sections, did not really get taken up in the film, and so I felt some disappointment around that. The power dynamics and how you deal with that.
Let's get into that a little bit more, but first, Ted, what about you?
Yeah,
you feel, or are you completely Vulcan?
I'm complete Vulcan. No, it's funny, I'm actually kind of anti-Vulcan in the sense that, when I first got into doing this work, one of my just absolute commitments was I was not going to get sucked in to the GMO kind of anti-science, anti-science, people believing in science, yelling at other people for not believing in science. So my sense was mixed in a slightly different way, which is, I actually think that the movie does a good job of kind of taking a lot of the crazy stuff sort of off the table. And at sort of some basic visceral level, I'm like, God, do I have to sit here and listen to the crazy stuff? Because I just want no part of it. And I'd like to get to having a kind of a sane conversation about food and agriculture. And so my hope, obviously, in the reason we were interested in sponsoring this conversation was to see if we could have that. So that was my sort of emotional reaction.
Is that what you're talking about when you're talking about solutions, Michael?
Okay, the thing that really is beyond, below all of this is the distrust issue. And those are large cultural issues, political cultural issues that are at play in a major dynamic. I know that, we talked about this 6 years ago in a little debate we did online, and that was, it was the same problem then, and nothing has really moved in that area. We're not talking about the power dynamics. We're not really talking about the roots of the ability for a corporation to basically patent something, change a few genes, and then claim the ownership of that product, which is really the product of billions of years or millions of years of evolution. So there are deep issues that haven't really been taken up, and I don't know anyone that's leading a conversation that's headed to a solution around that.
I just want to I'm not that worried about patents, not because I just think I think especially, as someone, who still considers himself a man on the left, even though I've kind of left the reservation on a bunch of things like GMOs and nuclear energy as an environmentalist. We don't like corporations. We don't like big things, which is actually relatively new for sort of, it used to be that the left was all about big. If you look at Marx, up until sort of the sort of small is beautiful kind of early 60s, suddenly, we were against big, and actually in a bunch of ways became kind of very distrustful of government, in many cases for good reasons. But when you really look at, this is a planet of 9 billion people. Like it or not, most of them are going to live in cities, and they're going to eat richer diets. They're going to eat higher on the food chain. And I think, whether it's Monsanto or someone or something else, and actually, in the U.S., where we have among the largest farms, average farm size in the world, most of those farms are family farms. They're just really big family farms. And they're very capital intensive because, especially now that it's gotten increasingly hard to bring in migrant labor from other places, it's very difficult to find labor. So it's gonna be big. And so I think we have to think about food systems that one way or another are gonna be big, get big. We can talk about corporate governance, we can talk about regulations, we can have various arguments about patents, but I think you have to, if you care about sort of the future of this planet environmentally, and if you care about, the many billion, the several billion people who are still in subsistence agriculture, and most of them, given the choice, would not be, you really have to kind of get your head around big, and you have to think about what agriculture and food on this planet looks like that's going to be big. So that's the conversation. Like I think a conversation kind of needs to start there, and then I'm happy to have a conversation about patents and regulation and ownership and all sorts of other things.
Pam, I don't think you have a dog in this fight, but you're an innovator. I don't know. Do you own patents?
There's one thing that I think gets a little bit lost that maybe hasn't been discussed. So there is big corporate patents in hybrids, and there's now down to maybe 3 major seed companies. They absolutely control a lot of the seed. And there's a lot of interesting discussion to be had about that in the United States and in Europe. But in the less developed world, so I work on rice, so I get to just like skate over all that stuff. Because I work on rice, which is a subsistence crop. It's a self-pollinating crop. Farmers are not buying hybrids from seed companies. They are looking for rice seed that can enhance their productivity, and they produce just enough grain to feed themselves and their families. So one thing that I think is important to keep in mind that for subsistence farmers, the seed is a scale-neutral technology. So whether it's genetically engineered or developed through a conventional approach, the power of the seed is it's scale neutral. You can have a tiny plot of land and can reap the same proportional benefits as if you're a large landowner. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, that there are certainly issues with patents and hybrids, and it's a very valid question. Do we want only 3 seed companies selling seed to farmers? And keep in mind that organic farmers also buy the seed from the same seed companies, so it's not organic versus conventional. But that is something to be discussed. But as a geneticist and as a husband who has a farmer and who's been to met farmers that have been planting rice that I've contributed to, I'm really happy to see scientific breakthroughs and innovations that can benefit even the smallest farmer.
Can I just jump in here? Okay. The interesting thing around this is that I agree. I have never argued vehemently against scale. It's not about scale. It's about paradigm. And the concern that that also wasn't really spoken to in the film is the idea that when you are supporting the idea of monocultures, you are inhibiting resilience. Because monoculture, why did that happen in the papayas? It's because they were growing papayas in the same place for a long time, perhaps, where they didn't have a lot of crop diversity. When you concentrate, you build pests. It was brought up in the film. So that's a concern when you have genetically modified crops and you can do it on mass scale. Are we really dealing with the issue of resilience to pests over the long term? So that's one thing that I think is important. I want to say something that I really liked about the film. The whole thing on confirmation bias and the question that was asked, when was the last time you changed your mind about anything in the last year? That was like the best part of the film, because in the debate, this debate, no one's changing their mind, really. Very few people are changing their mind, and it's a real struggle. And that's a problem.
I want to strongly agree and slightly disagree with what you said. So it's absolutely true. As a plant pathologist, the first thing we learn is that if you have genetic uniformity, it makes a crop vulnerable to epidemics. So that's absolutely true. But as a geneticist, what we're doing is introducing genetic diversity. So we're taking, whether it's a gene from an ancient rice variety and bringing it in, or a wild species of rice and bringing it in, which is what I do in my lab, or even farther out, like taking a gene from a virus and putting it in a papaya. You're actually bringing in genetic diversity. But at the same time, genetic engineering produces seed that, in a sense, are no different than any other seed. So for a farmer, whether it's genetically engineered or not, if it's a good seed that's giving them high yield and they don't have to spray something, they're going to plant a lot of it. So genetic engineering per se doesn't really change the very important questions about monoculture.
Well, and I just also, I'm not sure that you can do scale at the scale we need to do without a lot of monoculture. And that's true in the organic market and organic farming. When you look at just organics, which is still a very, even in the U.S., a pretty small share of the market, most of that is being met by pretty large operations that are doing monoculture. And you can just drive down through Watsonville, Monterey, Carmel Valley, down I-5 even, and you will see very, very big farms doing organic. And the only difference is they're using, in many cases, sort of quote-unquote natural pesticides, which are often every bit as bad as the stuff that conventional is using. They're not using synthetic fertilizer because they're mostly laundering it through cows that are conventionally raised and are grain-fed on conventionally grown crops. So that's where the fertilizer comes from to run those operations. And a recent big meta-analysis came out that actually showed that just consistently, on just about every environmental metric that you would care about, greenhouse gases, land use, nitrogen runoff, actually conventional farms per unit of food produced actually outperform the organic farms. So I think we, beyond, and several people said this, actually Fraley, who said, kept saying, well, it's just one tool and there's lots of important things. I mean, I think we have to sort of have a bigger conversation about what sustainable agriculture on a planet of 9 billion people looks like. And I would actually argue that GMOs aren't the most important thing, especially in a lot of parts of the world. People need, they need,
Kids are a distraction.
yes, they need fertilizer, they need roads, and they need irrigation, and they need access to markets, and they need functioning institutions.
You know, environmentalism has traditionally earned its stripes by stopping things and stopping the bulldozers and stopping the harpoons. But now we're in a situation where the status quo is unsupportable, and we really need to start things. And you know, if we can figure out a way to do mass production without monoculture, or build in some resilience and diversity in the fields, we're probably going to need some innovation and some technology. And if we're going to do that, we might need to be a little less precautionary. And I wonder what your thoughts are about how can we have an environmentalism that's advocating for starting and building rather than stopping?
I think we have to. I think I was actually in Salinas yesterday, driving through the country, talking about last Thursday and Friday. I was in Fresno on the west side. And Westland's the largest industrial agricultural place on the planet, and talking with farmers about the situation. And it's a screwed up situation. The water's messed up, the soil's messed up, there's all kinds of problems. So the question is, what are we going to do? And I think what we've got to do, I want to disagree with you a little bit. I have seen large-scale farms that have built-in mass diversity, beautiful forms of diversity. So it can exist. And in fact, we have to get to that. And we have to get to an agriculture that is constantly working to refurbish the soil, because without that, all bets are off. And soil is in deep trouble right now. And the truth of the matter is, I'm waiting to see, is there a genetically modified effort, or is there an effort with genetically modified crops to take on some of those issues? I applaud the work that's going on around water. I think that's really great. Drought. I think the whole story about the banana is awesome. What happened with the papaya is awesome. Those are the kind of solutions that have to be integrated in eventually when we can build enough trust. And still, we haven't got to the issue of what is going to create trust. That is the key issue.
I mean, if you're talking about biodiversity, I mean, just to give an example, and it's one that Pam knows really well, but, I mean, Roundup Ready corn, BT Roundup Ready corn, uses a lot of glyphosate, but that allows much lower levels of a lot more toxic stuff, including a lot less pesticide and insecticide. And the result is they actually get a lot more biodiversity in the fields. So there's actually it doesn't get rid of monocropping. And I'm with you. I think that to the degree to which we can get farmers to diversify to some degree and to rotate crops to some higher degree than they do, that would be good. But we also have to pay attention to the trade-offs. So, for instance, we just published a big piece looking at some of the trade-offs between having more wildlife on the farm versus more wildlife and habitat outside the farm. And so when, to have more wildlife in your fields, you produce with lower yields, there can be a real trade-off there in terms of actually lower yields requiring greater land use that in a lot of cases can have really problematic impacts in terms of converting other very important habitat into farmland. Yes, it's nuanced, it's complicated, and I think when we can kind of get beyond some of the screeching and the screaming and have a kind of a bit more, when we can take the volume down a little bit, I think we can actually kind of start to have more productive conversations about what some of those trade-offs look like and the best way to manage them in sort of democratic fashion, where we get to, it's not just the science that's going to dictate it. It's people, it's government, there's lots of stakeholders here.
If you Google Breakthrough Institute and land sharing versus land sparing, there's this whole one side and then the rebuttal and then counter rebuttals and then the sort of middleman. It's a really great diversity of opinions that you've collected there. What do you think about this environmentalism, pushing things forward versus stopping?
So we absolutely need innovation, and it's so interesting to be in the agricultural community where there's such a conflict about innovation, and yet we're Silicon Valley here. It's all about innovation, and so I think it's absolutely important to think forward. And I agree with the other two speakers is that the discussion about genes in our food is a huge distraction from these enormous issues, not only feeding the world, but guarding the soil fertility. We have very serious problems with land and water, phosphorus. It's absolutely true. We need to build resilience into systems. And this is really where we need all kinds of tools, every kind of tool, whether it's a organic farming technique or a genetically engineered crop. So there's no absolutes when it comes to farming. So farming is a dynamic system. There's not going to be a single answer. And I think for those of us in the agricultural community, we see that every day. But often, I correct me if I'm wrong, but in an urban environment, everybody just really wants to solve this problem and have one solution. And unfortunately, there is not one solution, but there are a lot of great approaches. And so for diversity in the field, it's actually getting better. So there's not only more crop rotation, and maybe Michael can correct me if I'm wrong, but when I was coming of age, we all learned about this very serious fungal disease on corn because all the corn farmers planted the exact same variety and everything was taken down in the 1970s. Now, most growers of corn, they'll plant different varieties in different parts of their field. So even within one farm, they'll plant different varieties. So it is changing. I think it is getting better, but absolutely we need to do a lot more. And I agree, soil, a lot faster on soil is a critical aspect. And whether or not you like herbicides, well, no one wants to spray anything. But if you are spraying herbicides, there has been a correlation with the use of these herbicide-tolerant crops and no-till farming, which really sequesters carbon in the soil. And the current scientific thought that it's very beneficial for enhancing soil fertility. So it's something unexpected. I don't think that was not the goal when herbicide-tolerant crops were developed. Farmers just wanted to find some non-toxic approach to control weeds. But this was a really unexpected, but very exciting effect that farmers are doing no-till farming, which means they don't have to roll their tractors back and forth and use all that energy and all that fuel and disrupt the soil matter.